Announce the results.
Ayes 114, noes 4.
The bill is passed.
Mr. Morelli.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Simbowitz, who's been anxiously waiting for the Aging Committee, would like me to call that in the Speaker's Conference Room. Members of the Aging Committee, Speaker's Conference Room.
Mr. Simbowitz wants Aging Committee members to come to the Speaker's Conference Room. Please proceed directly. Mr. Morelli.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're now going to take up the pay equity package that I referenced earlier this afternoon, and we'll take up the first three bills in this order while we await the A calendar to come to our desks. So the first bill we'll take up is calendar number 257 on page 26 of the main calendar by Ms. Titus. We'll follow that with calendar number 32 on page 9 by Ms. Rosenthal. And in this group of bills, we will then go to page 21 of the main calendar and take up calendar number 197 by Ms. Lifton.
Clerk will read.
Assembly number 6937, calendar 257, Ms. Titus. An act to amend the labor law.
An explanation is requested, Ms. Titus.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. This bill would establish the New York State Fair Pay Act, which would guarantee that individuals who have been discriminated against in terms of compensation will receive fair treatment under the law. Despite current law, unequal pay still exists as jobs held predominantly by women and people of color are underpaid due to historic discrimination. Jobs traditionally held by women and people of color have been systematically undervalued in the marketplace. The net result is that these jobs are paid less than comparable jobs with the same levels of skills and responsibilities, but commonly held by males. This legislation would establish that when a person, whether male, female, African American, Hispanic, Asian American, Native American, or any other minority, gets paid for doing work with the same requirements, the same education, the same responsibilities, their pay should be also the same. It is a principle that has been adopted in states and municipalities across this country for the same reasons why it is so needed here. The fact that this ongoing condition has depressed wages and living standards in our state, that it has reduced family incomes and contributes to high child poverty rates that we face in our state, and that it has produced an unfairness that is preventing New York from moving forward. We can only move forward in this state when we treat people fairly and equitably, not just under the law, but in valuing the work that they do.
Ms. Corwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
Will you yield, Ms. Titus?
Yes.
Sponsor yields.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate the discussion about the issue, and let me first start out by saying what an important issue it is, and I'm so glad we are taking this up today. I'm very interested, as I always am when I get up and debate a bill, on the mechanics of how the legislation would actually be implemented and what it would how do we actually make it work, the details. And my understanding from the reading of the legislation is that whereas we have in law right now the Federal Equal Pay Act of 1963, which means equal work for equal pay, we are now changing the definition of equal to include equivalent jobs. And so we're asking the Department of Labor to go into public and private employers and analyze the jobs that they have and then give them some sort of ranking or measurement and try to figure out which ones are equivalent. Is that how that works?
Yes. Again, it's not going to be a list created by DOL for all jobs across the board. It will be, I guess, more tailored to that specific employer and the jobs that they have within that establishment.
Okay, so are we trying to say that, and I'm just using this as examples, obviously, we don't have data in front of us, but are we trying to say that a secretarial position, because it's generally been dominated by females, is equivalent to another job that is dominated by males, say truck driving? Is that what we're trying to do is make a comparison between jobs that are traditionally female and jobs that are traditionally male?
I would have to say, in the scenario that you just described, it would have to be that particular industry, that establishment that hires X amount of employees, and that employer values each employee's work and their worth, so to speak. So it would be just that employer, if they are in fact paying someone less than someone that's doing comparable work based on their gender or ethnicity, then it would be a violation of this law.
So the comparable is being defined by Department of Labor coming in and assessing the jobs. For example, say we have a trucking company. They have secretaries working in the office, and they've got the drivers. Department of Labor would come in and look at those secretary jobs and those truck driving jobs and make an assessment as to how they compare.
Right.
And then base the pay based
Right. So
on.
the Department of Labor will make that methodology, and we will be comparing the requirements of skills, their efforts, their responsibility, and the working conditions.
Okay, does this bill allow for market factors such as supply and demand? For example, it might be more difficult to get people to be truck drivers, so you have to pay them more money to get them to take the job versus a secretary. Does it allow for that?
Yes, that would be considered a bona fide exemption, and yes, that would be able to be valued in to that particular job and title.
Okay, because the only concern I have is when we talk about this bona fide exception is when you talk about a bona fide exception that could be connected to gender, for example. And I'm thinking of an example where you may have, I'll give you an example from my workplace. Many, many years ago, I worked in an office in New York, and we had word processors and we had secretaries, and the word processors were males and the secretaries were all females. And the word processors got paid a higher wage because it was a more difficult, more tedious job. People didn't want it, so they tended to have higher pay. Now, it became a male job as well, I'm going to imagine, because the women, they didn't want that job because they didn't like the tediousness of it, the hours were bad. They worked the other job that had more flexibility. So, again, those differences are gender related. And my concern is with the language of this bill, are we not allowing for us to pay higher pay to one field, even though it's mostly male, but it's because the males are willing to take that job because their home life allows them to do it? I know it sounds very convoluted here, but
Right. I mean, just, again, what you're describing to me, just off the cuff, sounds like gender discrimination. So I would say that the reasons that you've given, just because a man would take this job as opposed to a woman, I think if the employer is basing that pay on such a foundation, I think that would be in violation of this law.
well, and that's the crux of the problem here, and I think that's why we have so much opposition to this. The language in this bill is because the employer is having to pay what he needs to pay in order to get people to do the job. Now, the people who are willing to do that job may be willing to do it because their home life or their circumstances allow them to take that job. And it's males, because if we're looking at traditional situations, the male.
But if that employer would not hire a female because they're basing it on their own prejudice that this is a job that's going to take too much time and a woman could not handle such a job, then that would be discrimination.
Well, but that's not what's happening. The employer isn't looking at that employee and saying, well, you're a male, I'm going to pay you more. He's saying, I need someone to fill that job. Okay, it's a man. Whatever, I have to pay X amount of money to get anyone to take that job, and it's
Right.
just men who
If
keep
it's
taking
gender
it.
neutral, if that employer has a gender neutral,
Okay.
decision-making, like any individual that comes forth and can handle those hours, and they will be compensated as such because it's such a hard job to fill, but not, I will hire a male over a female because this male would do a better job.
Certainly, I understand what you're saying. But again, I think you have Department of Labor coming in and making that determination. It's not the employer making the determination. It's up to the Department of Labor now. And that's a tremendous concern for me that you're having an outside government agency coming into a private employer making a determination as to that employer's thought process in hiring those individuals.
Right. Again, Department of Labor will promulgate that methodology, but it still would be up to the employer to value the specific titles in their employment.
So how would we know if that employer is employing that person because it's a man and paying him more versus the fact that he just can't get anybody else to do it? I would imagine the Department of Labor would be promulgating regulations in terms of some sort of enforcement action, correct?
I guess it would be the same scenario as wage theft. It's not, when someone makes that complaint that someone is discriminating, they will come forth.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate your comments, Michelle. On the bill, Mr. Speaker.
On the bill, Mr. Corwin.
As I had stated previously, I think this is an important issue for us to tackle, but I think, as usual, our problem here is it's not that we have a hard time understanding the problem, it's understanding a solution that's going to work. What this bill does is it causes the Department of Labor to go out and go into private employers and make determinations in terms of how their hiring practices are. What it doesn't do is it doesn't allow the employer to allow market forces to come into play nearly as neatly as might have been suggested. There are a lot of experiences that go into hiring an individual. As an employer myself, I've had the experience many times. I always said I'd take a little green man with three heads if that's the person it took to get the job done. And I think 99.9% of the employers in this state you would find would feel the same way. The problem here is that the Department of Labor would interfere with that decision making. They would have the ability to come in and make arbitrary decisions based on whether or not, this job, being a truck driver, is equivalent in value to the secretary working in that same company, and force them to pay them accordingly. I don't believe that that is a workable process, and I think it's inherently unfair what they're trying to do because you're basically trying to elevate or lower someone's worth to match somebody else's. And really the only person who has the ability to make a determination on value is the employer because they understand the role that each individual plays in the organization. So I strongly recommend a no vote for this bill. I will be speaking on other bills, and I have lots of suggestions of ways that we could solve the problem that would actually work and would actually not hurt people. And I will be happy to talk about that on a later bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Morelli for an announcement.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I apologize for the interruption, but if we could ask members of the Environmental Conservation Committee to meet in the Speaker's conference room. Mr. Engelbright is prepared to conduct that meeting.
Environmental Committee Speaker's Conference Room. Mr. Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the sponsor yield, please, for a few questions?
Ms. Titus, will you yield?
Yes.
Sponsor yields.
Thank you. Michelle, I'm just a little confused on
1
the
minute,
how.
Mr. Murray.
Yeah.
We have a host of conversants behind you. For what reason, I don't know. They wanted to hear you, Mr. Murray.
Okay.
And now they will. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Michelle, again, just I'm trying to grasp the process of how this would work. You had mentioned earlier that there will not be a list of equivalent jobs or work.
Correct.
So how would an employer know? I mean, it's up to them to determine, and then this would only be enforced if a complaint is made? Is that how it works?
Yeah, I mean, currently right now, employers value the different jobs that they have in their establishment. They pay, individual A X because of the value or the worth of what that person does in that particular industry. So they already do that. What this bill will allow is for the Department of Labor to establish methodologies for that particular employer, but it's still up to that employer to determine the various values of the jobs that they have.
Okay, so it'll be someone from the Department of Labor making the decision if a complaint is made that maybe adjustments need to be made. But if the employer disagrees, say, with the Department of Labor's decision, is there an appeals process or anything like that in place?
Right. I mean, whatever currently we have under the law.
So it sounds essentially once the Department of Labor says this is the way it is, that will pretty much be the way it is.
Right.
There's no real-
And we've put the Department of Labor with, I guess, this particular responsibility because they already know the various work sectors and work jobs that we have here in the state of New York. So they are already familiar with the various jobs that we have.
And what are some of the factors that they will be using to determine what is an equivalent or similar position?
The skills of that employee, the effort that it takes, the responsibilities that it would take, and working under similar work conditions in the same establishment.
Okay.
Those are the requirements.
So I'm gonna bring up another. First, I'll use the golden oldie that I've used in the past, and I'd like to present a scenario to you, and you tell me how this would be handled. So we have the New York Knicks, we have the New York Liberty basketball teams. One are males, one are females. One's in the NBA, one's the WNBA. They're owned by the same owners. They play the same game. They play in the same arena. They play on the same court, but yet they are paid vastly different. If one of the New York Liberty basketball players were to file a complaint with the Department of Labor, what would happen?
Again, I wouldn't be that person to make such a determination. That would be the Department of Labor to make that determination.
But it would fit several of the factors that you've just described, being same workplace, same conditions, same game. Wouldn't you agree that that would be kind of a prime example of a similar or equivalent job? So how would that be handled?
Again, I wouldn't be the person. It would be the Department of Labor, but just off the top of my head, I would say that there's other factors that can come into play why that would justify that employer paying, individual X from the Lakers more than, individual Y from the Liberties or something like that.
So in the years past, so this legislation actually does not then spell this out. I mean, it really puts a lot of power into the hands of the Department of Labor. Some person, some unknown person or entity at the Department of Labor that we really apparently don't have much input in.
Yeah,
So
no, I see it totally different. I think that what we're doing is we're maintaining that power with that employer to make that determination based on their own establishment that they have.
But, okay, so let me take it further. So a complaint is filed by a New York Liberty basketball player. They have the same owner, the Knicks and the Liberty. They're owned by MSG. So a complaint is filed to the DOL. The DOL says, yeah, you should be paid equally. The employer disagrees because of the amount of revenue generated by the Liberty compared to the Knicks would simply not allow them to pay that kind of salary. So what do? What happens in a case like that? Who is the determining factor as to the final outcome? Is it the Department of Labor?
Well, there's various mechanisms. I know that you can file a complaint with the Department of Labor or you can go to court. So there's different mechanisms to address that particular issue.
So if that's already in play, why are we passing this law? I don't understand. What are we doing with this?
In your scenario, what would be the remedy for a person in that situation that you just described is either going to court or filing a complaint with the Department of Labor.
Okay, I'm going to use another scenario because I think I'd like to show how we're actually contradicting ourselves as a state. So are you familiar with how much we've spent or given away in film tax credits over the past year or so?
No, I'm not.
Okay, this is kind of an old report that I have, but I saw a number. It says Empire State Development Corp. About $420 million a year in this film tax credit program. And this program is designed to bring production companies to New York to do films, TV shows, etc. And we give out literally hundreds of millions of dollars in tax credits to draw them here. And we say, we want you to come here because we know that that's going to bring a nice return on investment, at least according to the Empire State Development Corp, of tens of millions of dollars on top of that. So again, I'll give you a scenario. We're going to give out all of these hundreds of millions of dollars of tax credits to bring this film production company here. They come and they're filming a great new film. And the stars are Jennifer Lawrence and this budding new actor named Andrew Garbarino, who's not here now. Are you telling me that they're going to have to pay Jennifer Lawrence and Andrew Garbarino the same amount of money? And it can't be the lower amount, it's got to be the higher amount. So it doesn't matter which one has the star power, but this budding new actor is going to be paid the exact same amount as this superstar actress. On every film that comes to the state of New York, we're going to require that?
I mean, no, I mean, again, I'm not the person to make that determination, but I mean, you have to, experience also counts, that's a bona fide exemption. There are exemptions.
And that's in the bill, that
Yes.
these exemptions exist?
Yes,
That,
yes. Education, how long you've been on a particular job, those are all factors that can be used in valuing each title.
but can't they be used right now? I guess my point is, what is necessary with this bill? Can't they go to court right now and say, hey, I think I'm being discriminated against?
Yes, they can.
So I guess
And I mean, we also, I think, just passed legislation and policy that now allows employees to discuss their salaries without being penalized for discussing that, because that was a silent discrimination that we had to overcome. So there are laws that are in place to remedy, I guess, wage disparities, but this now having us the ability to compare various jobs and their worth is the next step that we need to take in the state of New York.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that. Mr. Speaker, on the bill?
On the bill, Mr. Murray.
I think the concern here is that we do have mechanisms in place, and in fact, I applaud this body, and I was very happy to support last year when we passed the Equal Pay Act, equal pay for equal work. When we start talking about similar or like work and values and things of this nature as to the value of a particular job or a particular worker, and it seems to me we're putting an awful lot of power into the hands of some unknown person or persons or entities within the Department of Labor to make these determinations. I think that's pretty scary right now, to be honest with you, and I'm a little afraid of what might come of this. But I will say this: I would urge this body to maybe hit the pause button on this, because I believe California just passed this bill, and I think it would behoove us to maybe just wait a little bit and see how this works out, because as I brought up the WNBA scenario, I fear that's going to be an issue in California right now when they start comparing the Lakers and the Lynx of Los Angeles and some of the other basketball teams there. I'd like to see how that plays out, because in the WNBA, you have salary caps that cannot be topped. They have these caps in place to keep it competitive. If they even think about trying to pay those teams and those players the salaries of the NBA, which generates so much more revenue, first off, they couldn't play in that league. They'd have to just fold up. So that would go against the rules of the league itself. So I'd like to just hit the pause button, see how that plays out, because I fear that we might actually be setting ourselves back about 20 or 30 years in bringing equality to pay, because we could very well be eliminating women's professional sports in the state of New York by passing this legislation. So I would urge my colleagues to really take a long, hard look at this and consider the unintended consequences of this bill, because we could be doing much more harm than we are good. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Butler.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would the sponsor yield for a couple quick questions?
Will you yield, Ms. Titus?
Yes.
Ms. Titus yields. Mr. Butler?
Ms. Titus, we just recently passed a new minimum wage structure in New York State, and within that structure, there's a different rate of the increase in the minimum wage for upstate than in the urban areas, the downstate areas, which I think correctly acknowledges a geographical disparity between the economies in New York State. I would anticipate not only New York City, but I would think in a Buffalo, a Rochester, an urban area, the pay scales would generally need to be higher. I think it's more expensive to live in an urban area. So my question to you is this: if let's say there's a cosmetic salesman in Westchester that's making X amount, and somebody just up the Hudson River in the Hudson Valley area that's making $2 or $3 less. Let's say they're both making minimum wage. Would we be putting ourselves in some kind of liability position so that this other person could sue and say, I'm doing the same job, I have the same qualifications, but this same person who's even working for the same department store as I am is making $3 or $4 more than me an hour? It's discrimination. Is that addressed in your bill, a geographic disparity?
Yes, most certainly it is. It's considered a bona fide exemption, and geographic locations are taken into consideration.
Are they actually specifically identified in your bill, the
Yes, it
geographic
is.
locations?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay.
Mr. Goodell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the sponsor yield?
Ms. Titus, will you yield?
Most definitely for Mr. Goodell.
Mr. Goodell, Ms. Titus yields.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. I note that this bill calls on the Department of Labor to develop a methodology for coming up with the same wage for different jobs, right? Different but equivalent in their eyes.
Yes.
Does such a methodology already exist in the United States?
Yes, there are current methodologies used by corporations. Yes.
And are there any similar methodologies used by any other state in the United States?
Yes, Minnesota in particular, but there are at least 15 states in this great nation: Minnesota, California, Oregon, Tennessee, West Virginia, and even Ontario, Canada has enacted similar policy.
And when you look at Minnesota, if I'm not mistaken, they actually have a complete job listing, correct, of what they consider to be equivalent positions.
I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure how they actually do that.
Well, I took the opportunity and looked, and I looked and found, for example, that a paralegal was listed as having comparable job skills and requirements as a master plumber.
In the same establishment.
Apparently, I mean, it was off the Michigan list. And so I asked my paralegal if she would mind doing some plumbing, and she declined, but I suppose that's a different issue.
Yeah, again, I can't speak for Minnesota. Here in this particular law, we will be, of course, looking at that employer and their establishment only, not across the board various employers employing paralegals and janitors or whatever your example was.
As if I'm correct, this bill says that if the Department of Labor, using this yet to be developed or published methodology, determines that two different jobs should be paid the same, and there's a discrepancy, am I correct that this bill prohibits the employer from reducing the higher paid one to eliminate that discrepancy?
Yes, correct.
And so the only thing the employer can do is raise the salary for everyone else.
For those being discriminated against. Yes.
And this requirement that they raise the salary for everybody else applies even in the context of a union negotiated contract, correct?
This doesn't affect collective bargaining.
But if you have a union negotiated contract that reflects that wage disparity, the employer must still raise everybody, even though the union contract specifies a lower wage, correct?
So long as the disparity is not based on discrimination.
But if the Department of Labor determines that those two positions are comparable, the fact that it's a union contract does not provide a defense to the employer, correct?
Again, so long as the justification is not based on discrimination. If it is a bona fide exemption, if they're looking at skills, they're looking at requirement, working conditions, education, so long it's those factors and not because it's predominantly a woman field.
So I'm looking at your bill on page 3, line 42, which says an agreement by an employee to work for, line 38. No labor organization will allow this to happen, and that would be a violation. Line 42, an agreement by the employee to work is not a defense. And am I correct, then, that a union contract that specifies a wage differential that violates this law would not protect an employer? An employer would be required to raise the lower wage, notwithstanding a union contract that specifies a different salary rate.
Again, this policy,
I think that's a yes or no answer. Yes, they have to raise it, or no, they can continue with the wage discrepancy.